Can a U.S. president really fire a Federal Reserve governor? And if that president is Donald Trump, could this decision reshape the entire American economy? This question is no longer theoretical. It's now at the center of a serious legal debate involving presidential authority, central bank independence, and the limits of executive power. The Federal Reserve is designed to operate free from political pressure, but Trump's legal team argues that the president must have full control over all executive officials. On the other side, critics warn that allowing a president to remove Fed governors could destabilize markets, weaken investor confidence, and permanently change how U.S. monetary policy works. What the courts decide here may redefine power inside the White House itself. To understand this case, it helps to look at how U.S. law defines presidential removal authority. The Constitution gives the president the power to appoint executive officials, but it does not clearly state when and how those officials can be removed. Over time, Congress created certain positions with fixed terms and legal protections to prevent political interference. Federal Reserve governors fall into this category, serving long terms specifically designed to insulate monetary policy from short-term political pressure. Supporters of institutional independence argue that these protections are essential for economic stability. Meanwhile, those favoring broader executive authority claim that elected leaders must retain oversight over officials who shape national policy. The Supreme Court now has to decide how these competing legal principles should be balanced. At this stage, the Supreme Court is not deciding whether the Federal Reserve made the right economic decisions. Instead, the justices were focused on a constitutional question: how much control does the president legally have over officials who lead independent institutions? The court is examining whether Congress intentionally designed the Federal Reserve to operate beyond direct presidential influence, and whether that design is protected under existing law. This involves reviewing past Supreme Court rulings on removal power, as well as the specific statutes that govern the Federal Reserve. In simple terms, the justices must determine whether independence is a legal safeguard written into the system, or merely a tradition that can be overridden by executive authority. Here is where the legal battle becomes critical. Under the Federal Reserve Act, governors cannot be removed simply because a president disagrees with their decisions. The law allows removal only for cause, which legally means serious misconduct, neglect of duty, or incapacity. Policy disagreements or political conflicts do not qualify as valid legal grounds. This requirement exists to protect the Federal Reserve from political pressure and to preserve economic stability. Courts have historically treated for-cause protections as binding legal limits, not symbolic language. That means even a powerful president must meet strict legal standards before attempting to remove a Federal Reserve governor, making this case a direct test of whether statutory protections can override executive authority. The phrase "for cause" may sound simple, but in legal terms it creates one of the strongest barriers against political interference. In U.S. law, it means an official can only be removed for serious reasons such as proven misconduct, failure to perform duties, or legal violations. It does not include disagreements over policy, ideology, or public criticism. Courts have consistently treated this standard as a safeguard for institutional independence. This is why legal experts describe the case as a turning point. If for-cause protections can be bypassed, it could weaken similar legal safeguards across many independent agencies. The Supreme Court's interpretation will determine whether these protections remain enforceable limits or whether executive authority can override them in practice. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of broader presidential authority, the legal consequences could extend far beyond this single dispute. Such a decision would suggest that presidents have greater control over independent agencies than previously understood. In practical terms, it could make it easier for future administrations to replace officials who oversee powerful institutions, even when those institutions were designed to operate independently. Supporters of this view argue that elected leaders should not be constrained by unelected officials who influence national policy. Critics, however, warn that this could weaken the legal safeguards meant to protect long-term economic stability from short-term political pressure. The ruling would not automatically change the Federal Reserve's structure, but it would establish a precedent future presidents could rely on. If the Supreme Court rules that a president cannot freely remove a Federal Reserve governor, it would strongly reinforce the legal protections built into independent institutions. Such a decision would confirm that for-cause limits are not symbolic but legally binding safeguards. In practical terms, this would mean presidents must meet strict legal standards before attempting to remove officials who serve fixed terms. Supporters of this outcome argue that it preserves stability, credibility, and long-term policy consistency. They believe independent agencies exist precisely to prevent sudden political shifts from disrupting critical systems like financial regulation. A ruling against broad removal power would not end future conflicts, but it would clearly establish that executive authority has constitutional limits. Although this case focuses on the Federal Reserve, its impact could extend far beyond monetary policy. Many other independent agencies across the U.S. government operate under similar legal structures, including regulators responsible for consumer protection, financial oversight, and market stability. If the Supreme Court expands presidential removal power in this case, courts may apply the same reasoning to disputes involving those agencies as well. That means future conflicts over environmental regulation, corporate enforcement, and financial supervision could all be influenced by this single ruling. Legal scholars say the case is really about how much independence modern regulatory institutions are allowed to maintain under the Constitution. In that sense, the decision will shape not only economic governance, but the entire structure of federal power. This case does not exist in a legal vacuum. The Supreme Court has previously ruled on similar disputes involving presidential removal power and the structure of independent agencies. In those earlier cases, the court recognized that Congress has the authority to limit removal power when it designs institutions meant to operate independently. These precedents established that not all executive authority is unlimited, especially when lawmakers clearly intend to protect regulatory functions from political pressure. The justices in the current case are closely examining how those past rulings apply to the Federal Reserve's unique role. Their decision will rely on constitutional interpretation, statutory language, and historical legal practice rather than short-term political dynamics. Regardless of the final outcome, this Supreme Court case is expected to influence how future presidents approach their relationship with independent institutions. A clear ruling will become a legal reference point that shapes how executive power is exercised for years to come. Future administrations may adjust their legal strategies and appointment decisions based on the limits defined in this case. Courts will also rely on this ruling when reviewing similar disputes involving regulatory agencies and presidential authority. In this sense, the case is not only about one presidency, but about setting long-term legal expectations for how power is shared between elected leaders and independent bodies. It highlights how constitutional interpretation today can shape institutional behavior in the future. Another important aspect of this case is how it could influence the credibility of the Federal Reserve itself. The Fed's authority is largely built on public trust that its decisions are based on economic data, not political pressure. If the Supreme Court allows greater presidential control over Fed governors, some analysts worry it could raise questions about the institution's independence in the eyes of markets and investors. Even the perception of political influence can affect confidence, financial stability, and long-term policy effectiveness. On the other hand, supporters of broader executive authority argue that democratic accountability should apply to all powerful institutions. The court's decision will therefore shape not only legal boundaries, but also how credible and neutral the Federal Reserve is perceived to be in the future. At its core, this Supreme Court case forces a question that goes far beyond Donald Trump or the Federal Reserve. It asks something much bigger. How much power should any president be allowed to control in a democratic system?
Should independent institutions remain protected from political influence, even if they make decisions that elected leaders strongly disagree with? Or should presidents have the authority to remove officials who shape major national policies? The court's decision will help define where accountability ends and independence begins. And that line will affect not just this administration, but every future one. So the real question isn't what the law says today, it's what kind of system should exist tomorrow. Do you think independent institutions should be protected from presidential control, or should elected leaders have the final authority? Share your view in the comments.